Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Andrew Laurence. I'm with the Office of Information Technology at the University of California, Irvine. This is the Unusual Suspects, telling the story of how my Windows-based desktop organization found our way around to doing Mac support formally after doing it informally for many years. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge all of our project contributors, subject matter experts, stakeholders. All of these fine individuals contributed to the project in ways that were large or small. I thank them for their contributions. So the organizational foundation begins more than 10 years ago. IT at UCI was decentralized in many ways. In a unit formerly known as administrative computing, they had a desktop support unit that was very classically corporate, Windows only. They took care of finance and HR and facilities, those kinds of departments, a lot of administrative executives. And so their service platform was built around that kind of client-side framework. Again, Windows-based, they used Active Directory, group policy pretty much ran the show. For taking care of data, they did redirected home folders. The storage was all DFS-based around campus. And then a wave of IT consolidation happened on campus. They had to change some tool sets because of costs, so they introduced BigFix, replaced a prior product that was used for patching and application deployment. But that's sort of where we started. And then the CIO said, so we're now a central organization for the campus. Y'all need to start supporting Macs now. Now, we knew this was coming. Fortunately, he was very understanding. He said, I realize this may take some time, but the answer used to be no. Now the answer is yes. So the first thing we did was, okay, well, when we touch a Mac, we have this thing called BigFix. It does multi-platform support. So the first thing we'll do is we'll put the agent on a machine. If we have to touch a Mac, we'll put the agent on the machine. That gives us a foothold. And we'll figure out what to do as we go. So in targeting how to support macOS, we wanted to ask some of the really core questions. How is it different? What's the state of the art on this platform? Is it that different from what we do? How do we wanted to define what are the goals of our service framework? How do we achieve those goals on this platform, not necessarily bending the platform to meet the template we already have? Do we have to buy things? Can we use what we have? What expertise do we have in-house? These are all questions we were asking ourselves over and over and over again. And looking through the framework of what we offered, we imaged machines every day, Pixie and MDT, nothing really different there. As part of our imaging process, after the MDT, in the MDT process, we kick up something that we call an initialization script, which happens to be written in PowerShell. Used to be a command script, now it's PowerShell, and it installs most of our standard payload of applications. Group policies used for quite a lot of things, and for the service integration, we used combinations of group policy and DFS for shares. Group policy group policy is used to mount any group shares, department shares that folks may need. We do redirected home folders for desktop machines, and we want to figure out, well, how can we do all of that stuff with macOS? And so we just started ticking down the list. For replication, we figured there were probably 3 different scenarios we needed to figure out. One is doing a standard reimage or an out-of-the-box kind of scenario. We also recognized that given that we were starting from a large number of machines out in the field already, we were hoping we could reach out to those machines and transform them into a supported configuration. Hopefully we can achieve that. And of course, we want to get to the ultimate panacea where in an out-of-box context, zero touch or at least minimal touch, we can turn it into a machine that is our machine, or the thing that we want to meet. So NetBoot DeployStudio. By the way, this project began formally about 4 years ago. Was finished about 1 year ago. So at the time we started this, thick imaging, NetBoot DeployStudio, that was the way we do things, so we're going to start doing that. And we were delighted with what we found because we liked the modularity of it. Of course, you can have, so we wound up with a small number of main deployment workflows, each of which is a workflow of many different workflows that did lots of different things, whether installing scripts or binding to the domain or installing applications or whatnot. And then as part of its thing, we would install all of our standard suite of applications, do a software update at the very end to bring it up to current patch level for that base level OS, and then some post-boot stuff would take us up to the deployment stage. Of course, by the time we finished the project, which was now a year ago, thick imaging was on its way out, but we figured, well, we've got a lot of extant machines out in the field already. This will help us bring those up to spec, and then we can reevaluate moving forward. Of course, these days, imaging is dead. Yes, still. But one thing we realized is that we've still got a lot of older machines out in the field that are not T2 hardware, that are not on High Sierra yet. So this is a perfectly valid process for taking those machines, bringing them up to patch spec, up to configuration, and putting them back out into the field. One of the things that we found, which was really useful, is that having gone through the exercise of DeployStudio and learning how to do packages, that if we built distribution packages, we can reuse them in other more modern contexts. So using the startOS install command, if you have a distribution package, you can tuck that into your startOS install command with the install package subdirective, and then that will just get slurped right in. That was really nice. And of course, you can reuse that in an Apple School Manager context as well. Love reusing work. So BigFix, how many in the room are familiar with BigFix or have heard of it? Using it today? Yes? Never heard of it at all? Wondering what the heck it is? Okay, about half and half. This will be fun. So BigFix used to be an independent product in the patch management, endpoint management field. It was bought by IBM 9-ish years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. They just finished divesting it. It's now, as of a week and a half ago, it's now a product with HCL. I'll talk a bit more about it. But if we have an endpoint that has the BigFix agent installed on it, then we can do stuff with it. So we can define content that installs software down to that computer to turn it into something that we already use. We can use BigFix to enroll it into an MDM if we want to. Still, we can do that, maybe not in 8 weeks or so. And then they have a concept called a baseline, which is really just a collection of actions. So I want all this to happen all at once, sort of like DeployStudio's workflow of workflows. Let's talk a little bit about BigFix and its working framework. I consider it desired state configuration that is marketed as patch management clothing. In a prior job, I was a Linux sysadmin building automated deployments using Kickstart and CF Engine. This is before Puppet and Chef came along into the world. And when I discovered BigFix, this felt really familiar because it has a dynamic evaluation language called Relevance with inspectors that harvest data out of the OS, out of the hardware. And using that dynamic evaluation, I can develop targeting for the way I want a system to be. And then the agent itself operates as root on the machine. It's effectively a root shell robot. So I can use dynamic evaluation to do targeting, and then if there's something I want to do, I need to figure out how do I make that happen in the command line on my endpoint OS, and then I can make that happen. What's nice about it is the endpoints run on multiple operating systems, so this general framework, the relevance language is platform independent. The inspectors are platform independent, usually. There's variance about how well different inspectors work on different platforms. But it's a root shell robot on whatever your platform is. And we already knew it pretty well, and we were hoping that this would work out well on macOS. The product provides patch content as a service. As these things are released from the upstream vendors, they just show up in your instance. I don't have to do a sync thing or a fetching thing or update my subscriptions to whatnot. They just appear. So they provide patch content on a continual basis for macOS itself, for the security updates, for Office, the usual list of Adobe stuff, Java. Java's a little weird because of Oracle's requirement for you to click the little checkbox before downloading. So they provide content that says you need a newer Java, but then you have to download the Java content manually, cache it locally, and then you can issue it out. But that's the same with Java on any management system. They also have a software distribution platform, software distribution module, so that if there's additional stuff you want to publish through the system, they have a little workflow thing where you can chuck in a DMG or something else, and it will cache it up into the content distribution and then transform that into an action that is deployable. Over the years, we've also developed templates, which we've developed templates that let us fairly easily, basically, we have a template, we fork it, change a few different values, and then we can install Mac software in a lot of the common distribution mechanisms. So like Firefox is a .app inside of a DMG. We have a template for that kind of model. If it's a straight distribution package, we can just shove that through the system as well. And this has turned into a framework which is quickly and easily deployable. As it is a root shell robot, if there's anything on the command line that you want to do, you can do it with BigFix. So as an example, we have content that enrolls it into our Airwatch MDM. We use the profiles command for that because currently we still can. And if we want to do field OS upgrades, we use the regular old start OS install command. Wait is a command in the BigFix in their action script. It basically says we're going to start this thing and we're going to wait for it to finish before we proceed to the next step. But root isn't root anymore, right? SIP, it continually constrains the scope of what root can do. There are areas of the file system that are increasingly unavailable to something running as root. BigFix is also not an MDM system, so you do need an MDM system. It can't do kernel extension whitelisting for you, although you can use it to produce a list of kernel extensions installed so that you can then figure out what you need to whitelist. It can't deliver privacy payloads. And there's also platform parity issues. For example, on the right here, each of these items listed, local group, DHCP enabled of network adapter, and user of process. These are inspectors that are available on other platforms, but not on macOS currently. There are ways that you can jump through gymnastics to get the same information, but that's an issue where platform parity of inspectors remains a challenge. So I thought it'd be fun to throw in some real-life examples of stuff I did this week while sitting at the conference about the Zoom thing. So relevance is the dynamic evaluation language. So the first on Tuesday, was it Tuesday that the Zoom thing first came out, or Monday? Right, the first thing that came out was, okay, well, drop this defaults right and you can block the automatic camera behavior in the Zoom client. So targeting to do that, I'm going to send this to machines so the inspectors we're using here is the operating system inspector. A property is Mac. I want that to be true, so Mac of operating system. I want to see that the Zoom application is already installed and it's in the applications folder. And then, so in action targeting, all the different all the different relevance criteria have to be true. So I want to see, so my goal is to install this plist file with the Z disable video item set to 1. So for targeting, I want that to not be there. So I'm going to see that not exists the file, and then a subproperty is that the Z disable video dictionary is 1. And then the action script is say, okay, well, sudo, go ahead and write that. And that remediates the camera issue. A little while later, the new update came out. I think that was later that night. So Mac operating system, and I'm going to see, and then my targeting is that if the Zoom application is installed of a version less than the one I'm about to install, then we are true. This gets a little bit more interesting. This is an example of some of our templates in action. So the stuff in purple with curly brackets is the dynamic relevance language. And this block is constructed so that when I need to copy templates, the only thing I need to change is those first 3 parameter lines, because those are the ones that are unique for every download. Everything after that is template-based and recycled. The 4th parameter line is for package file. That's where I'm figuring out the name. When I download the URL, I'm going to store the name in a local file name. And this particular one basically looks for acknowledging that files that are sitting out that I'm going to be downloading might have %20 spaces in the name. I'm going to rewrite those to be underscores when I store it locally. And then because I'm using parameters for these, the add prefetch item line is just a set of parameters. And then the actual thing is a very simple command line where we're running the installer, targeting the download folder and the local file I'm already writing. One thing I've noticed with BigFix, being a root shell robot, shell context occasionally can matter a lot. So for packages that install using Apple's installer, they seem to work better in an interactive sudo shell. And so that's just now part of my template. So sudo-i is just part of my normal thing there. Another one that is a little more interesting is sometimes we want to figure out how my BigFix agent runs as root, but I need to make a thing happen within the context of the user who is logged in right now. How can I make that happen? This is a solution I stole from Adam Linder, who works right here at Penn State. So Adam, if you're watching this later, thanks. The fun part is the very last line, where the proper way to make something happen in the user context is to use launchd with the as-user subcommand, and you need the number UID to make that happen. And I have that in a parameter, and then we have a script. So working from the bottom up, I find out the user's UID by using the inspector for current user. I need the user who that is, and then the ID that belongs to that, and I grab that as a parameter, so then I dump that to the launchd line. And then the other bit is using OSA script as a script processor. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm sending a very small Apple script through launchd that runs as the current user who's logged in and just does the logout thing. So that delivers to the user the exact same little window that would happen if they hit Shift-Command-Q. But it's that user in their context, and it uses the same user experience that they would have. So those are some examples of BigFix working on a Mac. Now then, the application packages that we install are nothing really surprising. Office, the Cisco VPN, Enterprise Connect, which is what we use for our Active Directory integration stuff. I'll talk about that in a bit. We use Free File Sync to copy our users' data up to their personal file shares, just to protect that data, make sure we have copies of it. And we use BombGuard for remote control. So for configuration management, of course, we started from a context of thinking about group policy, recognize that group policy is really just a Windows thing, but when we looked at it real hard and took it apart, we realized that it's a configuration management system that is native to the OS. And if we stared at it long enough and hard enough and squinted at it, we realized that MDM is not that different from a conceptual standpoint, in that it's a mechanism for storing configurations that manipulate OS native APIs to make a thing happen. So we thought, oh, all right, so maybe, I don't know if we can make group policy happen on macOS, but MDM seems to achieve a similar context in a mental framework that we're used to. So we thought we could embrace that. What we wound up with is using Airwatch. We have Airwatch as our MDM. We already had that in-house because of a separate project that preceded this by a few years. And we embraced our existing Active Directory philosophy in that we have many policies, each of which that does very small things. And that makes it easy to A/B test things. So for service integration, this is where we're looking to fill the gap provided by group policy and all the things that we shove through group policy. Some of the biggest things for us is, the most difficult things is for doing department group shares. And because with group policy, the way we do that is we have a group policy that mounts a share according to what OU you happen to be in and what groups you're a member of. There's a fly. So we figured, well, we'll need to be able to figure out, hopefully, somehow, to do a similar kind of thing. We don't want to rebuild an entire membership structure. We'd like to be able to similarly have some sort of mapping between groups that you belong to and shares that you need, and then we can hopefully mount them. We wanted to be able to protect that personal data. We didn't know if we would be able to use redirected home folders, but somehow, in the end, be able to grab the data that you have and copy it in a way so that the university has a copy of it. And we also wanted to acknowledge the fact that platform demographics are different on macOS. There's a much higher proportion of portable devices. So instead of designing for desktops and doing something a little bit different for laptops, our goal was to assume that every computer is a laptop and protect all data the same way, because we know that the demographics of the platform are different. We figured this was going to be fun. We figured it might be complicated. And we embarked on our adventure. And being young and foolish, our first thought was, maybe we can make Macs use Active Directory. That could be a thing. There's lots of third-party products that exist for this. So we found our way to Centrify. At first, it looked really awesome because it uses group policy. Being that our desktop group is Windows-oriented, we figured, well, if we come into it through a group policy window, then that will be familiar to the team. It'll help us to adopt it, help us to grease the skids on making this project happen. And it seemed to do all the things we wanted to do. We could use group policy. We could do shared share mounting through a similar framework. But the more we worked with it, the more because we thought, thinking, okay, great, it does group policy, it'll do what we want to do. Oh, some things are a little bit different. And then we need to use different OUs and different object sets. It's not going to inherit our existing group policies at all. We need to duplicate everything. And it began narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and we were having the conversation about, okay, well, we still can. Oh, okay, we still can. Okay, we still can. And eventually we got down to confronting the fact that it really worked best if you were on Ethernet and using network accounts. And then we remembered our platform demographics and thought, this isn't, And that was a year. This was the third time in my career where I was on a project where we nearly finished and realized we were in the wrong place, that we needed to just put it aside and start over. Very thankfully, our leadership was indulgent of that process. We didn't have to finish with a thing that we thought was ill-fitted to the solution, and we were able to get restarted. By this time, Enterprise Connect was no longer being whispered about in dark alleys. It had grown up quite a bit. It was very useful. We took another look at it and found that by this time, it had grown to pretty much what we hoped to find. The biggest things that we found were the most useful with it is that Enterprise Connect's processes are triggered based on network state change. So if you plug in Ethernet, if you unplug Ethernet, if you hop on a VPN, if you hop off a VPN, if your Wi-Fi SSID changes, all these things are network state change. It triggers Enterprise Connect to reevaluate its current state and try to do whatever it's supposed to do. You can configure whatever it's supposed to do via MDM, so that sounded pretty awesome. And it also has an option where, although you can configure, you can configure it to mount the default home folder that's in the Windows profile. You can configure it to mount a static list of shares, but we knew we needed to dynamically mount shares based on the user and the group memberships. And it has this thing for a connection script. So that is a great way where we can drive through custom business logic, do all kinds of interesting things, and hopefully maybe fill the gap that based on the way we use group policy to re-implement features on macOS. So in scoping out the connection script we realized that we needed to replicate mounting group shares based on security group membership. We needed to replicate syncing of personal data. In this case, we decided to basically borrow the concept and re-implement from our Windows deployments what we'd been doing for years on our Windows laptops, which is on our Windows laptops. We have a PowerShell script that on login looks to see if we can find the shares, and if it can, it copies your desktop folder and documents folder and a couple of others using free file sync and just dumps them into your personal profile directory. And we figured, well, we've already decided that's acceptable, so that's great. If we re-implement that, then we'll be in a good place. And being that we needed to evaluate network state changes, we wanted to be able to account for all these different network use cases in which the endpoint might be able to make SMB connections to our file services, or it might not. We wanted to evaluate all of them. The connection script is a shell script, so Bash, I suppose. I don't know much Bash. We're going to start trying to do Bash. This will be interesting. The campus Wi-Fi connection is odd, and when we presented this context to Apple, they said, yeah, that's unusual. So it is, if you have a machine that's domain joined and you pop it up on our Wi-Fi network, it finds the SRV records. You pass Kerberos, so the machine says, yay, I'm on a Windows domain, I can access all my stuff, but SMB is blocked. So I need to figure out very carefully what my network conditions are. Even though Enterprise Connect by itself does a great job of figuring out whether it can contact the Windows domain, that doesn't necessarily mean on my Wi-Fi network it can use SMB. So I need to do some more deeper inspection. So this is diving down the rat hole of shell scripting. The way we did this, the first thing is basically we get output from ifconfig, run some string operations, looking for the output for an adapter with base T in the name, and I try to figure out if that adapter is up or down. And then that tells me whether or not the Ethernet adapter is connected. Similarly, the Cisco AnyConnect client includes a CLI in it that you can just trigger for the status, and it'll tell you whether or not it's connected or not. So I can figure out whether or not I'm on VPN. I also need to know the SSID of the current wireless network. So buried in Apple's 802.11 framework is a CLI called Airport, and you can use that to grab output of the current conditions of the airport network. There's other ways of grabbing this information. This is the one I happened to find, and for some reason it seemed to do the job in a way that didn't drive me bonkers. Yes, sir?
What was that again, please? I was getting that up there. What's it called?
The CLI is called Airport. It's buried inside System Library, Private Frameworks, Apple 802.11.framework. All these slides will be available afterwards, by the way. So basically, I run the Airport CLI utility, run some string operations to grab the SSID of the current Wi-Fi network, and then just a set of Booleans, because the condition in which SMB won't work is if there's no Ethernet connection, the campus Wi-Fi is available, and the VPN is not attached. If those conditions are there, I know that SMB won't work. So I need to identify that condition, and if that condition is the case, then I error out of the script, because I know SMB is not going to work, so I'm not even going to try. Once I had all that case stuff done, we ran into a really weird thing where If you were on the VPN, sometimes the shares would work awesome. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes it was really slow. Sometimes it was fast. It was unpredictable, it was inconsistent, and it was not something we wanted to hand out to users. Now, at this point, I'd like to ask for some audience participation. If in your career you've ever scoped a solution, developed a solution, put it out into deployment, and then later found a problem, and your response was, I forgot. Has anybody had the I forgot? Yes. This is what happened here. Oh, yeah, this was me trying to figure out that problem. When you need to access SMB shares across DFS, you need to be able to access domain controllers directly. You don't necessarily know which domain controller you're going to be talking to. What happened in our case was, and before I say this, I'm going to thank our Windows infrastructure team for having the self-honesty to recognize what had happened and the courage to allow me to speak about it publicly. Over time, one of the things that they had done in their continual upgrading of the environment is that they had added an off-site domain controller for disaster recovery purposes. They forgot to put the domain controller in the VPN paths. So if you were on the VPN, you might be talking to a domain controller, you might be attached to a domain controller that you couldn't actually talk to. And that's why the shares sometimes would work and sometimes wouldn't. And their reaction was, I forgot. And they fixed it promptly, and then it was awesome. So that was great. Thanks, guys. Another unexpected complication was that in writing this bash shell script, I started off by using bash native regular expressions because I figured, well, I'm using bash, I'm going to use what's there. And it was behaving differently, because I had things working great as I was making changes to the script and running the script in my shell, but if Enterprise Connect ran the script, then I was getting different results, and it was driving me nuts. And after a while, I started figuring, okay, well, let's grab some debugging information, start echoing everything I can think of to find out what's different. So this was a very simple shell scripting solution of grabbing some environment variables about the shell that I'm using and dump it out so I can figure out what's going on. So when I executed this in the script itself on the command line, they both said, yeah, I'm bash, yeah, I'm bash. But when Enterprise Connect runs it, one of them says I'm SH. What? Turns out that Enterprise Connect, when it runs your connection script, it explicitly launches it with bin sh. Why would that matter? Because I'm using a shebang at the top that executes bash. So even though this doesn't make any sense, but it turns out bash, if launched with the name sh, has hard-coded behaviors whereby it mimics the classic sh shell. Never in my career have I had it actually matter, but this time it did. Turns out on many Unix operating systems, including macOS, bin sh is a copy of the bash binary. It might be a symlink to the bash binary. It might be a copy of the binary. But in many cases, bin sh is actually bash. So Enterprise Connect was explicitly executing bin sh to my bash shell. Bash launched up saying, hey, I was launched with the sh name, therefore I'm going to put in these hard-coding behaviors, therefore I had weird output. So the solution which is just use a shim script. So in fact, Enterprise Connect launches a script that explicitly launches bash. And that's how I worked around it. So the lesson there is to know your interpreter because shell environments actually matter. The connection script in the end, so one of the subtitle of my talk, right, was existing tools and harvesting knowledge. The shell script in the end is a bash script, but it pulls in tools from classic Unix commands, stuff that's unique to macOS, something that comes with the Cisco VPN client. So for example, I use diskutil for unmounting shares at times. DSCL is used for doing the group query to find out what groups we belong to. DSconfig ID is used to I read the computer record of the computer I'm on out from Active Directory just to make sure that the computer domain, the computer bind is valid. And then let's see, SMB util DFS is used to make sure that we have a DFS path that we can resolve DFS. And then the other stuff is used for all kinds of interesting things. So at the end of all this, we found a way to satisfy our operational precepts. This was a lot of fun. At times it was a lot of pain. Of course, nothing's ever done. There's always new work to accomplish. You might have noticed that I started out talking about 3 different concepts of replication. We only did 2 of them. The third one, Apple School Manager DEP, is work yet to be done. Little while today, early tomorrow, matter of fact, I'm going to a talk about somebody who talked about implementing modern deployments with School Manager a little bit late. That's the boat that we're in, so I'll be at that talk tomorrow. One thing we want to do is so right now when we sync user data, so if you have multiple Macs, you'll get the same data back again. If you have a Mac and a Windows machine, you will have different desktops and different documents because we're not persisting that data. There's enough platform distinctions between them. We didn't feel that was a safe thing to do. And so our story right now is that if you need data persistence cross-platform, then we recommend OneDrive or Google Drive or any of the things that we have business agreements for management of the data in the cloud environment. We figured those will do a much better job of it than we can do, at least currently, but that's still a goal. Enterprise Connect triggers its thing based on network state change, and that's fine and all, but that doesn't necessarily, or at a user login event like a screensaver. That's fine and all. I'd like to get something a little more frequent than that, so probably putting in a timed launch D to kick it off every now and then. And also that there's new features in Enterprise Connect since we finished this. Some of the new features look like, for instance, maybe some of the bizarre string handling I'm doing, grabbing stuff out of DSCL. Maybe I don't need to do anymore. Of course, Catalina has the new Kerberos single sign-on thing, which looks pretty awesome, but in Mike Boylan's talk yesterday, he clarified that the single sign-in plugin doesn't have the connection script option. So it looks like I'll be still doing a connection script for some mounts, for some kind of future. I'd love to find out if the single sign-on support supports multi-domain Kerberos, which currently is not available, supported in macOS. And lastly is, by the time we finish this project, I realized that I really should have been using source versioning all the way across, because although we did a good job of maintaining copies, I don't have a record of all the wrong turns we took. And that would be really, really useful. That's one of the things that version control is really, really valuable for. That to be able to go back through and realize that, oh, that's right, I tried this before, and here's why it didn't work. So with that, I'd love to take your questions. Anybody? Anything at all? Yes, sir.
At one point you mentioned about backups of...
Oh, hang on. Catchbox?
Yeah, that'll help.
Ah.
Hello? It's blinking. Now it's on.
There we go.
Okay, at one point you asked, you mentioned that you copied your user folders to certain things from your user folders to back up. What do you use for a backup?
So for backing up user data, we're using an application called Free File Sync. It's sort of like rsync, sort of like Robocopy. We're using it because we were already using it on the Windows side. You can, one thing that's nice is that you can feed it, they call it a batch script. Basically, you configure a configuration of what you want to copy, what you want to exclude, and the destination path. And so in our connection script, we have a step down toward the bottom that after I figure out that all the network conditions are good and I can mount all the things, then we go ahead and trigger that batch script, and that grabs the desktop folder, the documents folder. We exclude things like VMware virtual machines, and we exclude some of the really big, heavy stuff. And then we copy that out to our DFS file shares. Any other questions? That was means I was either very thorough or very, very boring. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I'll be around.